Hello, everyone. I'm going to wait for a few people to chime in before we really start, but this is going to be the first episode of Rogue History. So I hope you guys are ready to learn about some history with me. Let me know if you're here in the comments because I am not using the Facebook application. I am using Restream, so I'm not on Facebook right now. So if you can see and hear me, let me know, and then that will tell me when we're ready to get started. Hello. Can everybody hear me? This is the first time I have used this microphone, so the on-off switch is a little touchy. Perfect. I'm so glad you guys are here. Let's jump in. We're probably going to be here for 35, 45 minutes. I'm hoping we might go a little long, depending on how many questions you guys have. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to Rogue History. I am your hostess, Elaine. You guys all follow my Facebook page, Libertarian Redhead, but my real name is Elaine. This is our first episode of this series. I plan to do it for the whole year. It will be every other Thursday at this time, 7:30 Eastern. I am super excited to share my love of history with you, and I really hope that you enjoy learning something with me. Episodes of Rogue History will, for now, be every other Thursday, live streamed, like I said, at 7:30 Eastern. Speaking of, let me talk about what Rogue History is, or what it's meant to be, what I hope it will be. I want to present to you lesser known figures and events from history that the majority of people probably aren't familiar with. All of us know history and the people in it are just as complicated as people living today, but most of the time our textbooks only present us with one version of a person or event skewed for better or worse. I want to give you the total picture without hiding glaring flaws or glossing over good intentions, even if the results are terrible or deadly. I personally appreciate balance, and I think all of you will too. So today we are going to be learning about Dr. Joseph Warren, who was a famous patriot, but a lot of us don't even know who he is. If you do know who he is, drop a comment because I would love to know. I had no idea who he was until I started researching this episode. I'm glad you like the mic. I probably will not be interacting a whole lot in the comments. If you guys have questions, feel free to drop them. I will either answer them during the stream towards the end, or I will answer them later on with another comment when I can go back through and read everything. So I'm just trying to keep everything on time. Yes, my hair is still red. It's just the lighting. You may have to adjust your brightness on your computer, but let's talk about Joseph Warren. I have a bunch of links that I will post later in a comment for you guys to reference things about him, and also an audiobook suggestion that I used to put together this episode. I will try in the future to put those in the descriptions of the live streams so that you guys can go back and look over the information for yourselves. Joseph Warren was raised on a farm, and the principal crop was apples, and he worked the farm with his parents. His father was a preacher farmer and married a much younger woman, and they raised 4 boys. Joseph was the oldest of these 4 boys. Their farm was located in Roxbury, Massachusetts. If you are unfamiliar with the Boston area, it's about a 20-minute drive away from Harvard. Joseph's childhood was full of lots of things that young boys dream of. He swam in the pond that was on his family's property. He learned how to hunt and how to fish from his father. He assisted in lots of farm chores and played with the farm animals, I'm assuming. He helped his father also sell their wares at the local market. His family was not very wealthy, but they were not destitute either. He was an incredibly bright child, and his parents recognized this early on. So they sent him to the local Latin school for an early education. The school, I believe, either still stands or is has a historical marker, and it was called the Roxbury Latin School. He was a bright student in addition to being a hard worker on the farm, and by all accounts, his parents were loving and hardworking people, and he had a happy childhood. At 14, he was accepted into Harvard University. Class sizes at the time at Harvard were less than 50 each, and the campus consisted of 4 buildings and less than 10 faculty members. It is a far cry from what we think of as an Ivy League education these days. Students were actually expected to maintain the grounds of the campus as well as adhere to a very strict daily schedule. They were to rise early and they didn't go to bed until very late. This was his first experience. This was Joseph Warren's first experience living away from home and his first opportunity to rub elbows with wealthier sons of Boston and New England. One's class ranking at the time was not based on academic merit the way that it is now. It was based on social standing. And Joseph, because of that, was ranked at the lower end of his class. And it's kind of speculated that that type of structure was difficult to overcome and that Joseph really didn't like it because he had been raised to believe in fairness and justice. So the freshmen at Harvard were very heavily hazed, and campus culture was such that most freshmen paired up with a wealthier upperclassman and were kind of expected to sort of be their servant or their errand boy, their gopher. It was definitely not a vacation, and the boys found many opportunities to create mischief. Joseph had a great sense of humor and was known for doing things like nailing his classmates' shoes to the floor, sneaking frogs into their pockets, or tying all of the tin shaving cups with handles together and hanging them above a faculty member's door so that when the faculty member came back late at night and opened the door, all the cups would fall to the ground and startle everyone in the vicinity and wake everyone up. When he was a little bit older, he shimmied up a drain pipe on one of the campus buildings to get to a room where a bunch of his friends had locked him out. And upon reaching the window of the room, his friends gave him entry through the window, and the drain pipe collapsed just as he climbed in, and it fell several stories to the ground. So it was a pretty, near miss for him. He definitely could have been very hurt. His classmates were stunned, and apparently Joseph just kind of looked around the room and said, "Well, it was a helpful drain pipe." The students were allowed 4 vacations from school every year, including 4 weeks in the summer and 2 weeks in late October. For Joseph, it was an opportunity not only to help his father with the fall harvest, but also to enjoy his mother's cooking. Harvard did not take care in providing good food, and the students often supplemented their meals by fishing or hunting small game near the campus. And if you know anything about Harvard or grew up in the area around Harvard, that reputation followed them for almost 200 years. So it's pretty sure that Joseph's mother, I mean, I'm a mom, I would definitely not send my child back to a school like that without filling their bag full of all kinds of homemade treats. So on one of these trips home, tragedy struck. And in 1755, Joseph's father fell from a ladder while he was picking apples, and he died in mere minutes because he had broken his neck. So for the family, this was a huge loss. It greatly influenced Joseph going forward and his younger brothers. The accident took a toll on them financially as well, but his mother was very determined to keep the farm going well enough to continue paying for Joseph's education. And the tone of Joseph's future visits forever changed because in his father's absence, he became the patriarch of the family. So at Harvard, he befriended lots of those wealthier sons of Boston, like I mentioned earlier. Boys like Sam Otis, who was the future quartermaster of the Continental Army, John Avery, who became the founding member of the Loyal Nine, which was kind of a subset of the Sons of Liberty. And he maintained a friendship with his roommate, Abel Leonard, whose father, much like Joseph's, was a preacher, and he was raised on scripture. During his Harvard years, many colonists still considered them loyal British subjects, even if they had Whig tendencies. After he graduated from Harvard, Joseph returned home, intent on making the farm the success that it had been when his father was still alive. So at this point, I'm going to take a little chat break because I've just been reading. Oh, hi, there's a lot of you here. I'm so glad that you're here. Yes, Charlie. I have not gotten to that part yet. I'm just covering his early life. But yeah, he was very involved in the Masonic Lodge. And I'm glad that you confirmed that Roxbury Latin was still in existence. I did not notate whether or not it actually was. So we'll go ahead and continue. I want to keep this moving along. So Joseph actually returned home and accepted a teaching position at Roxbury Latin, but he decided that he was kind of bored with farm life. So he decided that he wanted to move back to Boston, where it was a lot more lively and there were a lot more opportunities. About a year after he moved back to the farm, he ended up returning to Boston and he joined St. Andrew's Lodge in 1761 after becoming interested in the Freemasons. So we are covering that. Um, that organization, if you're not familiar with the origins, it migrated to America shortly after 1700, and lots of his Harvard classmates and other alumni of the school were already members. People like Paul Revere, Thomas Crafts, and John Hancock were already all members of this lodge. So after Joseph's moved back to Boston, he began his independent 2-year study to earn a Master of Arts in Medicine from Harvard. It was kind of like it was definitely an independent study. He did not have to go to Harvard for classes. And it's also thought that during this time, that he and some of the other medical students were actually grave robbers and that they would dig up bodies to use for dissection and study and things like this. He ended up writing his dissertation that attempted to prove that obstructions were only one cause of disease. And at this time, the true nature of disease was fairly unknown. People were very superstitious. They still had a lot of they didn't really use traditional medicine in the way that we think of traditional medicine. Everything was based on herbal remedies and things like that. So usually when a man of good means or a man of means graduates with this kind of degree, they then go to Europe and apprentice under the best in the medical field. But Dr. Warren could not afford a luxury like that. So he moved in with a wealthy man named Dr. Lloyd, and he worked alongside him while still completing his 2-year study. During this time, he developed his bedside manner, learned surgery, how to run a practice, all of those things. And during this time, he also acquired a taste for the more luxurious things in life because Dr. Lloyd led a very opulent lifestyle. He lived in one of the larger homes in Boston and on a very kind of prominent street. And Joseph had never really been around that kind of a lifestyle before. So it was sort of a culture shock for him. He'd only really heard about that from his classmates in the past and never really lived that type of lifestyle. But it was extremely appealing to him. And that carried through into his adulthood. So around this time, at the close of the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, depending on what you want to call it, the generous loans provided by the crown to merchants of the Bay Colony economy dried up. And this was one of the catalysts that led to the Revolutionary War. Britain had incurred massive debts during the war, and merchants could no longer easily procure loans. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? The resulting economic policies that Britain implemented, as well as other unfortunate and coincidental events, were ultimately catastrophic for the relationship between the Massachusetts colony, as well as other colonies, and Great Britain, or England, I guess at the time. That's what it was called. So contrast that, they had lots of very bad weather for several years running, so crops were not growing. They were having a lot of trouble just stimulating their economy and surviving. I believe around this time, there was also a smallpox outbreak that killed a lot of people. Obviously, everyone's living in very tight quarters in the inner city of Boston. So this was a very dangerous epidemic. And contrast that to, the outside world. Warren's life, things were going really well. He married an 18-year-old heiress named Betsy Hooton. She was a very attractive girl. She was from one of the wealthier families in Boston, and his brand new practice was growing. Within a year of his marriage to Betsy, his family grew again to include his firstborn daughter, Elizabeth. They ultimately had 4 children together. His practice served all levels of society, and his patients included well-known future Whigs and also British loyalists, including but not limited to Samuel and John Adams, his friends Paul Revere and John Hancock, and Whig printers Benjamin Eads and John Gill. His skills as a physician allowed him to be a part of that kind of upper crust level of society, but for very intimate moments in those people's lives. It placed him in an intimate circle of trust with these men. And Joseph was also known as being a very generous man, despite being plagued with on and off financial difficulties at various times of his life. His medical ledgers tell us that he would cancel the fees and debts of his poorer patients from time to time, or for patients that were undergoing considerable economic stress. He did not want to add to his patient's suffering. So if someone was going through a really hard time in their life and something happened, like their child broke an arm or their wife was having a baby, Joseph would just say, "That's okay. You can pay me when you can, or I'll just cancel your debt." Leading up to the passage of the Stamp Act, so we're getting a little bit further along in Joseph's life, he became more and more politically outspoken. He sided with his longtime friends and members of the now formed Whigs, and he published articles in the paper owned by his friends Eads and Gill. He called the Stamp Act, and I quote, "a grievous and unconstitutional tax." He revealed the hidden dangers of allowing Britain to tax the colonies endlessly and, as he perceived, without consent. So at this time, he was advocating for legal and nonviolent resistance to these acts, but his stance very quickly evolved based on the British response to the colonies. And he became more and more insistent and more accepting that the longer this continued, the more likely it was to end in violence. So by 1765, when the Stamp Act Congress met, the members attempted to unite the colonies in opposition to England together for the first time. This was unprecedented, and most colonies until that point had almost seen each other as competition for resources from England. Every economic policy originated in England. Not very many of them originated in the colonies themselves. And keep in mind, the governors and governing bodies of the colonies were all full of British loyalists. Those that weren't started to split off, and you started to see more colonial shadow governments start to form. So the colonies had kind of been in competition with each other for these resources. And this was the first time that they all kind of banded together and said, no, we're all united and none of us like these policies. So Joseph wrote to a friend not long after the Congress and claimed that the colonies had never had more of a reason to be alarmed by British overreach than they currently had should the Stamp Act be implemented. Of course, it was implemented, but by 1767, Warren's practice had grown steadily. He was writing newspaper articles regularly and becoming more and more involved in Massachusetts politics. The Townshend Acts were passed the same year, sending the Whigs into a frenzy of anger, Warren included. He and many others signed a non-importation agreement meant to hurt influential merchants across the pond. And in early 1768, Samuel Adams circulated a letter to the legislatures in the other 12 colonies encouraging them to stand together against the Townshend Acts, which prompted the British Secretary of State, Lord Hillsborough, to instruct the governor of Massachusetts to dissolve the colonial legislature unless it rescinded Adams' letter. The other side of that story is that the Massachusetts legislature had to vote whether or not to reveal the author of that letter. The House voted 92-17 against rescinding the letter or revealing the identity of the author. So the Massachusetts governor dismissed the general court, forcing Warren and everyone else to conduct their business in the town meetings. And then he banned the town meetings. So things just kept escalating from here. Obviously, we're getting closer and closer to that magical early 1770s period where the revolution finally, we were in the thick of the revolution. And Warren was really instrumental in this time period. He wrote lots of letters, and unfortunately, shortly before his death, he went through all of his papers and destroyed these letters. So the only letters that we have of his are that other people have kept through the years, that have been passed down through their families, given to museums and things like that. So I think that's part of the reason why a lot of people don't know who Joseph Warren is, because he, unlike John Adams, who just took extensive notes about everything and kept all of them and didn't destroy anything, he became sort of a mystery and kind of a legend. So back to the time period that I was speaking about before, the late 1760s. So the Massachusetts governor dismissed the general court, and everyone had to start conducting business either via shadow governments, which were commonly known as committees of correspondence. Warren twice delivered orations in commemoration of the Boston Massacre. And the second time he was in full regalia. I think he wore a toga. And there were British soldiers occupying Boston at the time, and they were shouting insults at him. People said he looked a little bit pale before he kind of got up to speak. And then he delivered this absolutely fiery, address and just got the crowd really worked up. And that was the point in which the British soldiers realized that Joseph Warren was a man to be reckoned with and that they were going to have a problem if they pissed him off anymore. I'm going to go back and check and say hi. Yes, Ed, we know that you dream of a marriage to an 18-year-old heiress. I'm glad you guys are all apparently intently listening because there are lots of people watching, but very few comments. So I will just keep talking. So while practicing medicine and surgery in Boston, Warren actually was the person that conducted the autopsy on the body of Christopher Cider in February of 1770. Christopher Cider was a British colonist killed in the political strife that became the Revolutionary War, and he was only 11. He was shot and killed, lots of people say accidentally, by a man named Ebenezer Richardson. So his funeral became a major political event, and his death just heightened all of the tensions. Richardson was a customs service employee who had tried to disperse a protest in front of the shop of a loyalist, and the crowd threw stones that broke his windows and actually hit his wife. So Richardson just stuck his gun out through the window and fired into the crowd to try to get everyone away from his house. And he wounded Cider in the arm and the chest. And Christopher later died that evening. Samuel Adams had paid for his funeral, and it was attended by more than 2,000 people. He was buried in the Granary Burying Ground, and all of the victims of the Boston Massacre are buried near him. So that's just a little side tidbit. In 1774, Warren also authored a song called Free America, which was published in colonial newspapers. They call it a song, but it was more like a poem. You could set it to music. He notated that the poem was supposed to be set to the traditional British song, The British Grenadiers. I hope I said that right. I might not have. Someone can correct me. So Warren was appointed to the Committee of Correspondence. And I kind of alluded to this earlier. A Committee of Correspondence is not something that we have now because it's a shadow government that was organized by the patriot leaders in all of the 13 colonies, kind of leading up to the American Revolution. As governors were dismissing and dissolving these general courts and committees that were officially sanctioned, people in the colonies had no other choice but to form a parallel and shadow government within their own colony that superseded not only the colonial legislature and royal officials, but they were instrumental in setting up, in Maryland's case, the First Continental Congress, obviously, which was very important and met in Philadelphia. And the committees of correspondence were called the committees of correspondence because they were responsible for spreading information. Basically, I don't want to say propaganda, but they were spreading information about British actions between the colonies and foreign governments. And the committees were rallying opposition to common causes and establishing plans for collective action. So they were the beginning of what later became a formal political union among the colonies. But at this time, they were very unofficial and they were very secret. So a total of about 8,000 patriots served on these committees at the colonial and local levels, comprising most of the leadership in all of their communities. And they promoted patriotism and home manufacturing, which is very strange, but I think it was more considered self-reliance. And they advised people to avoid luxuries, lead a more simple life. And that was due to Britain taxing a lot of the things that were considered luxuries. So they were advising, what to boycott and how to boycott. They also set up espionage networks to identify disloyal elements, displace the royal officials, and help topple an entire imperial system in each colony. By late 1774 and early 1775, these committees supervised the elections of provincial conventions, which took over the actual operation of colonial government. So they were very important. So that made Joseph Warren a very, very influential man in Massachusetts, and people looked to him for guidance and things like this. So Joseph Warren is working this practice. He's very, very busy. He's got a young family. And by the time 1775 rolls around, he's a very influential person in Massachusetts politics. And I'll give you kind of a little preview because we'll talk about it a little bit more at the end when I address his legacy. A lot of people said that given his trajectory at this point in time leading into the American Revolution, if he had survived the war, which he died very early, he likely would have surpassed George Washington as far as notoriety. And people think that he probably would have regulated Washington to kind of a footnote about, oh, this great general. And that would have been it. So a lot of people had very high hopes for Warren and his political future. But by mid-April of 1775, Warren had become friends with Benjamin Church, who was another doctor, and he was also on the Committee of Correspondence. Lots of members had relocated outside of Boston because at this time Boston had been under siege by the British for a long time. The city had kind of been occupied by now. So on the afternoon of April 18th, the British troops in town mobilized for a long-planned raid on the nearby town of Concord. And already before nightfall, word of mouth had spread the knowledge of the mobilization. Joseph Warren was the man who told Paul Revere, I need you to go ride. And ride he did. So it was his idea to do one if by land, two if by sea, I believe. And some people argue that Warren received additional information from an informant close to General Gage. And some people speculate that he had an affair with Gage's wife, Margaret, but there's really no supporting evidence. That relationship is on full display in the History Channel Sons of Liberty series, which is one of my favorites, even though it has a lot of historical inaccuracies. There is no historical record of the two of them ever meeting or having anything to do with each other. I'm going to check back in with the live chat really quick. Hi, friends. You guys are amazing. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Thank you. Maybe I'll just like read chapters of history books to you guys, like good history books, not the ones that like skip over things. Oh, Ed, you're here and you're taking notes. I love it. Ed is my co-host on Monday nights, you guys. And he does all of the tech. I had to set up all the tech for this podcast, which is why it's not nearly as put together as when he does it. So hopefully by next time I will have everything a little bit more together. So let's go back and we'll talk more about Joseph Warren. So Warren managed to slip out of Boston early on April 19th. And during that day, he coordinated and led militia during the battles of Lexington and Concord. He had at this point been given a commission and the title of general. And instead of hanging back, he said, no, I want to be on the front line. So when the enemy were returning from Concord, he was among the first hanging back, and just when they were retreating from Concord, the Patriot militia was hiding all along their route, and they were literally just picking off soldiers from the outer edges of the march. And he was one of the first ones that was doing this. And it was during this point when he was nearly killed because a musket ball struck part of his wig. So it was very close to his head. And when his mother saw him after the battle and heard of his escape, she cried and she said, "Please don't risk your life. It's too precious." And he said, "Where danger is, mother dear, there must your son be. Now is no time for any of America's children to shrink from any hazard. I will see her free or die." And then he went right back to recruiting and organizing soldiers for the siege of Boston. So he was, like I said, commissioned as a major general by the Provincial Congress on June 14th of 1775. Several days later, moments before the Battle of Bunker Hill, he arrived where the militia was forming and asked where the heaviest fighting would be. The General Israel Putnam pointed to Breed's Hill, or Bunker Hill. Warren volunteered to join the fighting as a private against the wishes of General Putnam and Colonel William Prescott, both of whom requested that he serve as their commander. He declined this command in the belief that Putnam and Prescott were more experienced in war and strategy. He was among those inspiring the men to hold their rank against superior numbers. He was known to have repeatedly declared of the British, "These fellows say we won't fight, but by heaven, I hope I die up to my knees in their blood." Another one of my favorite quotes from Warren was in a letter to Samuel Adams. And he said, "The mistress we court is liberty, and it is better to die than not to obtain her." And this was June 15th, 1774. So it was a little over a year before he died. So after the during the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British decided to storm the redoubt, which, if you don't know military terminology, a redoubt is kind of a how do I say it? It's a fortification, but it's not necessarily meant to be permanent, and it's very small. He was killed instantly by a musket or a pistol ball in the head. It entered just below his left eye, I believe, by a British officer. There is speculation that it was possibly a lieutenant named Lord Rawdon who recognized him, or by one of his servants. This was supported by a 2011 forensic analysis of his skull. Now, the next part I can't go into too much detail because Facebook will take me off the air, but the British soldiers were so savage to Joseph Warren after he died. He was stripped of his clothing. He was bayoneted until he was unrecognizable. And then he was basically just heaved into a shallow ditch with everyone else and left. And that was how he died. There were people that watched this happen that were so disturbed by the ferocity that the British soldiers showed Warren that it kind of solidified their resolve of, we are doing the right thing, because if they could do this to someone like Dr. Warren, they would do that to any of us. His body was actually exhumed almost a year after his death by his brothers and also Paul Revere. And Paul identified the remains by an artificial tooth that he had placed in Warren's mouth himself. His body was placed in the granary burying ground, and then later in 1825 at St. Paul's Church, before finally being moved in 1855 to his family's vault in Forest Hills Cemetery. General Gage's reaction to his death was that even though General Gage obviously wanted to win the battle and probably didn't have any certain affinity for Warren, he said that his death was equal to the death of 500 men, supposedly. It encouraged the revolutionary cause because it was viewed by so many Americans as an act of martyrdom. So at the time of his death, his children were staying with his fiancée. Yes, I said fiancée because several years prior, his wife had passed away in Worcester as refugees from the siege. Yes, Charlie, I said Worcester correctly. She continued to look after them, gathering support for their education from John Hancock, Sam Adams, and especially Benedict Arnold, which was kind of surprising, obviously, given what happened to Benedict Arnold. Joseph's youngest brother and apprentice in medicine, John Warren, served as a surgeon during the Battle of Bunker Hill and for the rest of the war, and afterwards founded the Harvard Medical School and co-founded the Massachusetts Medical Society. His other brothers also led very prolific lives, and there are at least 4 statues of Joseph Warren on public display. 3 of them are in Boston. One is in the lodge adjacent to the Bunker Hill Monument. Another is on the grounds of Roxbury Latin School. The third is atop the pudding stone at his gravesite. And the 4th is in a small park in the corner of 3rd and Pennsylvania Avenues in Warren, Pennsylvania. A city, a borough, and a county are all named after him in Pennsylvania. There are 14 states that have a Warren County, And New York County of Warren is also named after him, but the town of Warrensburg that is within that county is not, just in case you live in the area and thought that it might be. He was a Scottish Freemason and, maintained those relationships. He was actually known as a friend for a little while. From He was known as a friend to some British soldiers for a little while because they were missing their Masonic lodge homes from England, and he invited them to join his lodge. And he was hoping that it would foster more cooperation between the two kind of opposite sides of the coin. Obviously, that proved, not true, and it didn't really stop the revolution. But early on, when he was still advocating for civil disobedience and peaceful protesting and things like this, he was hoping that those friendships would help the British soldiers see the colonists' point of view. And that didn't exactly happen. As I said, a lot of people have speculated that Warren would have become so prolific in his life that he would have regulated George Washington to a footnote in history. And to me, that was so profound because obviously George Washington is kind of thought of as the father of this country, generally. So that's the story of Joseph Warren, of his life, of his death, of his legacy. I hope you all enjoyed learning about him with me. Like I said, I will drop the links to all of the articles and the audiobooks that I use to prepare for this podcast. One of the audiobooks is about 12 hours of listening time, but it's totally worth it. I learned so much. I hope you did too. And we will be back not next week, but the week after. And I have another very interesting person to share with you. So if you have any questions, I'm going to scroll back for a couple minutes and just see if there's anything I need to answer, if I forgot anything. I hope I didn't forget anything. No, I will not be covering modern politics on this series. I'm just covering lesser known events and people in not necessarily ancient history. Obviously, the American Revolution is not ancient, but I would say probably pre-1980s. I'm really glad you guys are enjoying it. Thank you for the compliments. I appreciate it. I do not usually do solo podcasts, so this is new. All right. So with that, I'm going to say good night because it doesn't look like you guys have any questions. If you watch this back and you do have a question, just drop it in the comments and I will eventually see it and come and answer it. So have a great night and I will see you in 2 weeks. And no, there's not going to be a test. Maybe I will come up with a test for you, just for you guys. So have a great weekend. Have a great week. And I will see you next time.